And it's just like you could feel it even through the TV screen. Like there was just the incredible energy. And so I was like, wow, it would be really cool to be able to capture some of this same energy for Black women as it relates to mental health. So I got on GoDaddy that evening. The domain was available.
Of
And
course.
it started as just a blog, right? Like I was writing about like, how do you find a therapist? How do you make the most of your support system? Just kind of general mental health topics. And it wasn't until 2017 where I added the therapist directory and the podcast to Therapy for Black Girls.
This is Heard Business School, where we sit down with private practice owners and industry experts to learn about the business of therapy together. I'm your host, Michael Fulwiler. Therapy spaces were not designed with Black women in mind. My guest this week is changing that. Dr. Joy Harden Bradford is a licensed psychologist and founder of Therapy for Black Girls, an online space dedicated to encouraging the mental wellness of Black women and girls. She's also the host of the award-winning Therapy for Black Girls podcast and author of Sisterhood Heals. In our conversation, we discuss why it's so important for Black women to have spaces designed for them, her journey building Therapy for Black Girls, and how she balances being a public figure as a homebody. Here's my conversation with my friend, Dr. Joy. Enjoy. Dr. Joy Harden Bradford, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael. I'm excited to chat with you.
So excited that you're here. This is a big moment. I feel like you're like the Beyonce of podcasting. Is anyone?
That is definitely going on my resume. That's definitely going on my resume now.
Very much appreciate our relationship and friendship, and excited that we're able to have this conversation today.
Exactly. Me too.
So you grew up in small town Louisiana. I've heard you talk about how your mom had 10 siblings, which is wild. And you remember growing up, like sitting on the porch with your grandma. Can you tell me a little bit about that and what that was like?
I love that you know so much of my lore already. But yeah, so very small town in Louisiana, and grew up in a big family. And I spent a lot of time on the front porch with my grandmother, which is where I think I became very curious about human behavior. So just kind of like paying attention to like what was happening. Like we grew up across the street from a church. And so like just all of the comings and goings and, like what's all happening over there? So I think I just saw so much and would make up stories about like what I thought was going on. And I didn't realize until I got to high school and had a chance to take a psychology class that there was actually a name for like being curious about human behavior, which was psychology. So I took the class in high school and really have never looked back. I majored in psychology as an undergrad. And then, of course, this has become my career.
I love that. It reminds me of Susan Johnson, who created emotionally focused therapy. She talks about how she grew up in a pub in England. And so there was just always people coming and going, and she just was very curious about people and their conversations. And that makes a lot of sense. I definitely want to talk about your educational background as well. So let me read this out here because it is impressive. So you have your bachelor's in psychology from Xavier University in Louisiana. You got your master's degree in vocational rehabilitation counseling from Arkansas State. And then you got your PhD in counseling psychology from the University of Georgia. You wrote your dissertation on depression and anxiety among Black people attending predominantly white academic institutions. As a Black woman, did you feel comfortable or accepted in these programs?
So, Michael, first of all, I don't know that I have talked about my dissertation topic super publicly. So you have been deep
I did my research.
Deep in the research. It definitely was difficult, right? So, when I was at the University of Georgia, I believe the percentage in terms of like Black students was like lower than 7%. It might have been even less than that, right? And so being a part of a Black Graduate Student Association and other organizations where other students who were like me and kind of experienced the same kinds of things was really imperative, I think, to my success. Otherwise, not only were there few students of color on campus, but it's also just a huge campus. And so I think otherwise I would have felt very alienated. It would have been very difficult, I think, for me to find my footing. I was really lucky, I think, to have the support of my department and to have a major professor who was really encouraging and like really wanted me to study the things that I wanted to study and would advocate for me. So I think it was being a part of those organizations and finding like my little niche is what really allowed me to be successful.
Yeah, I read an interview that you did with the APA. I think it was in 2018. So I went way back. And you even described it as hostile. Like, was there some hostility from faculty or administration?
Yeah, so now you're digging up difficult memories, Michael. So, there was a lot of in our graduate program, like there definitely were some instances of racism. And when we would ask questions about it, like faculty would not be open to having those conversations. And I remember distinctly there was one situation where like we had raised so many questions and like gone on record with so many things we felt like were wrong that we were like released from our practicum program, which was unheard of, right? Like so the department had a like in-house training clinic that we were all mandated to do as like whatever, I don't remember what year in our program it was. And so they were so unhappy with how unhappy we were that they released us from our practicum, and then we had to like go out into the community to find our own training experience. So I mean, so it definitely was very hostile, and it became very difficult to like even recommend the program to other people because it's like we don't know what kind of experience you're going to get here because it really depends on the faculty.
And did that influence your decision to want to work with college students after you graduated?
I feel like that decision probably was already in place, but I definitely think it furthered it, right? I think it furthered my reasoning for wanting to be a voice and be an outlet for students who are on campuses like the one I was on, just because I was very acutely aware of how that could impact your mental health and that you would need support.
Yeah, and what did you observe about Black students seeking mental health services? Were they coming to the counseling center?
Yeah, I definitely observed, and I've been on lots of different campuses. So I was at the University of Georgia, I was at Emory's campus in Oxford, I was at Virginia Commonwealth University. So I've been on lots of different campuses, and across the board, I would notice that the Black students would not come into the counseling center as much as their peers. So on every campus I was on, I would always do these outreach groups, whether it was in like the minority students office, minority students in programs, or with the sororities, or working with different student organizations to run groups for the Black women on campus, just so that they knew there was somebody in the counseling center who they could, talk with if they wanted to, but also to give them some information around mental health and like what does it actually mean to take care of your mental health.
Definitely. And at what point does private practice become something that you're interested in as you're, working as a college counselor?
So, College Counseling Center is super flexible. And so I don't know that I had thought about like a private practice until I saw so many of my colleagues. So, because College Counseling Center hours are often flexible, right? Like you don't typically work a 9 to 5 because, grad students and other students have evening hours. So, typically the counseling center is open until the evening, at least a couple of days a week, which meant that our schedules could be flexible where most of us had like a half day off. And so many of my colleagues would like work at the counseling center, but also have like one day a week where they had their own private practice in the community. And so I was able to work with some colleagues to kind of have an office space. And I was like, oh, this seems like a cool thing to do. Like I can, have some additional income and still kind of work with clients privately in the community. And so I think they modeled that for me and made it really easy for that to be something for me to step into.
Were you at Emory at the time?
I was at UGA at the
UGA,
time.
okay. So we had Dr. Ayana Abrams on the show, who I
Yeah.
know is a friend. And
Yeah.
I think as kind of when she was kind of getting started, she had like heard of you. And so I actually didn't realize, as long as we've known each other, that you were in private practice at one point.
Yeah.
Because I know, and we'll talk about therapy for Black girls, but so I wanted to chat with you about that. And so it sounds like you had some good models for what that could look like. Were there any challenges, or was there a learning curve for you, starting to work with clients outside of a traditional college counseling center?
I wouldn't say so, just because again, I think the infrastructure was already there. Like, other colleagues gave me like their paperwork and I just like changed it to my name and like that kind of thing. And because the counseling center, I mean, most counseling center therapists will tell you there's always a wait list. And so we were able to get referrals from the counseling center. And so people who might not have been a good fit for the counseling center or, for whatever reason, other colleagues would refer them to you in practice. And so it wasn't really hard to, kind of have a full caseload as much as I wanted it to be full. So I wouldn't really say that there were any challenges kind of getting started.
And then did you ultimately transition into private practice full time, or did you just continue to do both?
Yeah, I never actually transitioned into full-time private practice. So once I left the counseling center world, I left for therapy for Black girls. And so I was always somebody who worked on a college campus and then had like a half day where I would see clients privately.
Let's talk about therapy for Black girls then. Where did the idea for therapy for Black girls come from?
So it came from watching the Black Girls Rock award show, on
I saw,
BET.
I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was watching it in my living room and just it was just such a beautiful example of Black women giving each other their flowers, right? Like people celebrating each other in the field of entertainment, but also education. And it's just like you could feel it even through the TV screen. Like there was just this incredible energy. And so I was like, wow, it would be really cool to be able to capture some of this same energy for Black women as it relates to mental health. So I got on GoDaddy that evening, the domain was available,
Of
and it
course.
it started as just a blog, right? Like I was writing about like how do you find a therapist, how do you make the most of your support system, just kind of general mental health topics. And it wasn't until 2017 where I added the therapist directory and the podcast to Therapy for Black Girls.
So it started in 2014. From 2014 to 2017, you're writing blogs. Is it growing? Are you starting to get like a following? What was happening during that time?
Yeah, I was writing blogs, but also like sharing posts, I think, on social media. And I was starting to do more media interviews. So, people would be writing an article about Black women's mental health or something mental health related, and they would start to reach out for me to like give a quote or give some ideas for their stories. So that really was what was happening in that between time before the podcast and the directory got started.
Yeah, I remember I went back and looked. It was 2018. Huffington Post wrote an article about you. The title of that article was "This Psychologist is Changing the Face of Therapy for Black Women." And I remember I was running marketing at the Gottman Institute, and I was traveling the country to trainings and conferences. And this was my first exposure to, the therapy industry. And I'd look around at these conferences and there'd be very few black people, Black women. It was like mostly white women. And so there was really this lack of representation that to me was so obvious. And so when I remember seeing that, I was like, oh, this is someone that I want to meet and talk to. And I think that we had interviewed you for our blog. And then I know that we had sponsored an event at one point. And so when I came with the Gottmans to Atlanta, it was like a no-brainer. So I reached out to you to see if you'd be interested in hosting us for their book tour events, and we got to meet, which was really nice.
Yeah, yeah. I remember that definitely. And I agree with you, right? Like I feel like those at that time, people were kind of insular. Like we weren't necessarily doing a whole bunch across the country. And so I love that social media has really been an opportunity for us to kind of be more collective and share, training opportunities and ideas about our practices.
I'd love to drill into this evolution of the therapy for Black girls ecosystem, because you look at it today and it's really big, right? But it just started as a blog. So how did the directory come to be? Where did that idea come from?
Yeah, I think it came primarily from me being very active on social media and like just paying attention to the kinds of conversations Black women were having. And I started to, or I continue to see people say like, "Oh, I'd love to find a Black woman therapist. Does anybody have a recommendation?" And I was like, "Why isn't there a place where like this exists?" Right? Like it felt like enough people were asking that there should be something. And so I started it as a Google Doc as a way to kind of respond to all of these people saying like, "Hey, I want a recommendation." So it started as a Google Doc where people could either nominate or recommend their therapist. And eventually enough therapists heard about it that they then wanted to kind of self-nominate or, sign themselves up. And so it was just like me in a Google Doc separated by state. And you could just link to people's practice websites, and kind of connect with them that way. And it quickly became too difficult for me to manage like manually, right? Like as more and more people became interested, I realized that I needed to put some infrastructure around it.
How did you do that? Did you go hire someone to build a website?
I want to back up, Michael, because it feels like I had the Google Doc ID and then I immediately moved into this thing. I actually resisted having the directory go beyond a Google Doc because I'm not a tech person, right? Like I didn't even know which questions to ask. I didn't know who I needed to build this website, right? Like I just knew that it was somebody who wasn't me. I went to a training, or I don't know, training kind of therapist expansion. So it was a workshop in San Francisco put on by Allison Salmon Pereira, and Tiffany McLean, who are two therapists in the field who do a lot of helping therapists kind of think about what's the next step for your practice. And so I went to this program. It was called Next, to think about like, okay, I'm kind of, not wanting to necessarily do as much practice. What is the next thing? And so I talked with them about the idea that I had started the directory at the time, but it wasn't necessarily the thing that I was thinking was going to happen next. And as I'm explaining it to them, they were like, "What are you talking about? Like, this is the thing. Like, you're sitting on this huge project. There's clearly interest. Why would you not move forward with it?" So it was through them and them helping to connect me. I think one of them had like a developer colleague or something who they put me in touch with. And that is when I began to learn the language of like, okay, this is what you need, a website developer, and this is how they build it. And, so it was really through that program that I got like the push to actually not be afraid of the code and stuff, and that there would be people there that I could lean on to help me to build the things that I didn't know anything about.
I mean, this is 2017. So in 2025, there's a lot more directories now. There's also, it's easier to build a website. The technology, the tools are much more user friendly. So, this was almost 10 years ago. Were there specialized directories at the time? Like, I remember at that time, it's, Psychology Today is the big one. We had the Gottman Referral Network, but I feel like that was like
That was all
pretty
I was
unique.
really,
Yeah.
aware of. I don't feel like there were a lot, maybe some more niche ones, but like Psychology Today for sure was like the one that, most therapists would sign up with.
Then what happened? So after you attend this event, get inspired. Maybe it validates that there's, an opportunity here.
I think I started having conversations with developers and got price quotes and was like, "Oh, this is expensive. Like, this is a free thing, right? Like, nobody's paying for this right now. I can't afford this." But then I started shopping around and then used the website Upwork to find like an independent contractor who I forget which country he was in, maybe Albania, who was able to build the first iteration of the directory for me that was, pretty cost effective. And so that's where it started. And then I started charging therapists to be listed in the directory because as it continued to grow, it was costly to manage. So that's when I started to charge for it.
And was it growing organically through word of mouth? Were you having to market it? How were you kind of thinking about growing it as it started to generate some revenue?
Yeah, all of it really grew by word of mouth, right? So people finding therapists, therapists telling each other, like, "Hey, I'm getting a bunch of clients from this resource. You should check it out." But we also got some pretty big, like, podcast hits. So there was a very popular podcast at the time called Another Round, which was hosted by two incredible Black women, Heaven and Tracy, and they shouted out the directory. So that helped it to grow. Solange tweeted about it. Solange Knowles tweeted about it. And so, that really kind of organically happened. And that after that tweet, like the website went down because I think so much traffic came to it. So, it really was organic and just word of mouth and people just being like happy they were able to connect with these therapists.
That's amazing. And now it's really like the premier directory to find a Black female therapist. I'm curious about the podcast. So did the podcast and the directory, those both were launched in 2017, kind of both at this during the same year?
Yeah, they both were 2017. The podcast launched in April, and I feel like the directory was later, but I don't quite remember the dates of that. But they were really independent, and I didn't necessarily think about them as a part of like a larger ecosystem. I think they both were just things that I was curious about, right? So the podcast I started because I was at the counseling center at Clark Atlanta University, and I had like a 45 minute to an hour commute each way. And so I started listening to a bunch of podcasts. And so as I was listening, I was thinking like, "Oh, this would be a great like addition to like the blogs that I'm already doing, right? Like I could podcast about some of these topics." And my husband actually has a background in radio production. And so I was like, I have an in-house producer. So I don't
I didn't know
probably
that.
have to, yeah, I probably don't have to expend a bunch of money to
Yeah.
get this done, right? And so it just started as something I wanted to try. And then again, it took off, right? So I don't think either of them started as me thinking like, "Oh, this is like the next step of my business." I don't think I thought any of them would become things that I would monetize. I just kind of was curious and, they took off because people were interested and there was a need there.
So many therapists that we have on the show have that experience where they just tried something. They didn't plan on. There's no 5-year business plan here or a 1-year business plan.
Right. No
Like we're
business
just
plan
gonna
at
try
all.
exactly, and that's okay, right? Like I think it gives permission for listeners to try something and just kind of see how it goes and kind of not get stuck in that perfectionism of, oh, this isn't ready yet. So it sounds like your husband, was he producing? He was the initial producer of the show,
And he
so he's
still
doing
is.
all the. Oh, he did.
Yeah, he still is.
That's awesome.
He
I
still
didn't
is.
realize that.
Yeah, at the time he was also employed full time outside and was producing kind of on the side. And now he is a full time employee of Therapy for Black Girls. And so now this is his full time job. But at
Oh
the
wow.
time he was just doing it like late in the evening, when he would get home from his other job.
You say that it took off. Was there a moment where you felt like, oh, there's something here, that you felt like there was really some momentum? Or
I don't know if there was any one particular moment, and I think because, again, I wasn't thinking about it as a thing to be monetized, I was most excited that people were actually listening, right? Like, I was most excited that it was, generating conversations and, people were really excited. They would write in and suggest topics, and so I think I was most excited that people really were engaged and really felt like the content was something that they've been looking for, that was helpful to them. Of course, we have now joined the iHeart podcast network, so that definitely was a huge marker of success, that there's now outside interest in the podcast. But I think initially I was just most excited about people actually listening and responding and using it as a resource as I intended it.
how did the iHeart partnership come to be? Did they approach you?
So there was a producer who was with iHeart at the time who listened to the podcast and suggested the podcast to like the higher ups in iHeart and said, I think we need to have a conversation with her. This podcast is doing really well. I think we could bring it into the network and really help to amplify it.
Is there anything about podcasting that's been surprising to you that you weren't expecting?
All of it. All
Yeah.
of it. And I think for a lot of people, right, when you are a consumer of podcasts, especially like a lot of the podcasts I listen to are like, friends chatting or, kind of pop culture catch up kinds of things. And so it sounds like, oh, we're just listening to like a conversation like that you could be having with a friend on FaceTime, right? I think the part that has been most surprising to me is the amount of work that actually goes into something that sounds pretty like laissez-faire. There's actually probably a lot of time that goes into having the conversation, somebody editing the conversation, putting it together, uploading it. Like there's a lot of hours that go behind the scenes of a 30 to 45-minute episode that I would not have imagined on the front end.
How long would you say that you spend on one episode, kind of end to end, like all inclusive?
Ooh, well, me, probably 2 hours, but I also have a team, right? So I think probably each episode is probably like a 6 hour or so endeavor because there's time spent searching for the guests, doing a prep doc where we're preparing like, okay, what kinds of things do we want to cover in this conversation? 2 producers are listening to it before my husband does the final pass. And then, we got to write the show notes, upload it, share it on social. I mean, so it probably is about a 6 hour thing all in for one 30 to 45-minute episode.
Yeah, I mean that's been my experience hosting this show. I think there's just so much that goes on behind the scene, and it's really a craft too. It's been some of the most meaningful work that I've done, so I get to have conversations like this. Would love to talk about how you've built out your team and how you've thought about that. Who was the first person that you hired and what led to that?
I think the first person I hired was my executive assistant, who is now our business manager. So I love that like so many of my team members have been able to like grow into different positions, because that feels really important. But I think she was the first person I hired to help me with like some of these interview requests and like as I got speaking engagements. I think she was the first person. And then the second person I hired was actually our community manager, who's still our community manager, Jasmine. And we started, we have a Facebook group for the podcast called the Thrive Tribe, where people kind of talk about the episodes and like different kinds of mental health topics. And so every week when we would release the episode, Jasmine would like by Friday have like all of these notes about like the episode, right? Like, hey, I took notes about the podcast, I want to share it with the community. And I'm like, she's already community managing. Like, I gotta hire her.
Right.
So I think that that is also a very clear indication of how this business has been built, is that it has been very community first, right? Like, it is very much paying attention to what kinds of things people say they want to hear. How do we respond when we, know big things are happening in the community? And I feel like that is still kind of at the heart of what we do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How big is the team
So
today?
there are 14 people on the
Oh
team
my
now.
goodness.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
That's grown a lot, at least in the last few years.
It has, yeah. And I think, as these different parts of the business expands, then it requires more and more people to kind of do that work.
Definitely. Yeah. I remember reaching out to you. I don't know when that was, 4 or 5 years ago. I had left my job. I had started my own consulting business, and, I offered to advise and work together. I don't know if I gave you much of a choice, but
It was a
said I'd love
very
to work
nice
together. Yeah.
symbiotic
Yeah.
relationship.
No, absolutely. But I think at the time you had a very small team. And I just remember, saying like, we got to get some help. We got to get some other people in here. So I want to talk about speaking too. So for listeners who are interested in getting speaking opportunities, what advice would you have? And, what's worked well for you and what hasn't worked well in terms of, getting speaking and also getting paid as a speaker?
Yeah, so I will say that the podcast honestly is the biggest lead magnet, I think, for me. I will say probably a good 75%, if not more, of the speaking engagements I get are because somebody listens to the podcast and then they want to bring me into like their ERG group or their university or some organization they work with. So that could be a great thing. Now, I won't necessarily say that you need to start a podcast, though, to use that as a lead magnet, because you've already heard me talk about how much work it is, right? So I wouldn't necessarily say to run out and start a podcast, but you could also do that by being an outstanding guest on podcasts. I have heard from a lot of the guests on Therapy for Black Girls that people will listen to their episode and then reach out to them to book them to speak certain places. So I think that that's a hack that maybe a lot of people don't know, is that you don't necessarily have to have your own podcast to be able to use podcasting as a great lead magnet for speaking.
We had a guest from the first season who reached out to me recently and said, the episode that we did was the highest ROI podcast appearance I've ever had. I've had all these people reach out to me for coaching. And so for me, that's great, right? Like if we can give folks who come on the show, a platform where other therapists can connect with them and, learn more about them, hear their stories, but also want to work with them. I think that's a win for everyone. I'm curious, for you as a podcast host, what makes a good guest?
Somebody who's familiar with the podcast, I think. Now, definitely, like you already heard me say, my team is sometimes searching for particular guests to talk about a thing. But for people who are pitching the podcast, it really helps if you are familiar with the format and like the kinds of topics that we talk about. So somebody who has done their research and their homework in terms of like, oh, I know they've talked about these kinds of things, but I think I could add this particular spin, or they haven't talked about this and I know this is really my lane. Let me pitch this to them. So somebody who has really done their research, who is good at using plain language to talk about like some very heavy topics sometime, right? Like we really aim to not use a bunch of jargon on the podcast. The podcast is meant for a general listener. It's not like a clinician podcast. And so you may be great at what you do, but can you talk about it in a way that like a general audience could listen to it? I think that that also makes a really good podcast guest. And somebody who's not like over prepared. I think a lot of times, people get anxious, right? Because this is weird. Like we are, talking on this camera, but somebody who like just is comfortable that they know their stuff and doesn't need to like, oh, what exact questions are you going to ask me? Because again, we do great work as clinicians. And I think sometimes we can over prepare, and that makes the conversation not flow as effortlessly as it would if you were just, talking without being super rehearsed.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I used to share questions. If someone asked me who's coming on the show, hey, like, could you send questions in advance? I'll absolutely do that. Cause some people maybe just want to think about what they want to say, but I've moved away from that because it does end up feeling scripted and rehearsed, and it doesn't flow as well.
Yeah, we do that too for people who ask, but most often, like, I go off on a tangent, right? Like something you say
Right.
will like spark some interest in me, and I'm
Yeah.
not looking at the questions anyway. And so it can be helpful to give you just like a framework for what you think the conversation will be, but also to just be open that, the conversation could drift naturally.
Definitely. As you think about how to grow the podcast, are you thinking about bringing in guests who are higher profile, or how do you select guests for your
Mhm.
show?
Yeah, so I feel like we have a mix of guests who are, higher profile and not higher profile. We really are more focused on the topics, right? Because I don't know that a higher profile guest necessarily like indicates more interest. I think what typically is what drives listeners for us is that people really, really want this information, right? Because I think the episodes that do best for us are the ones where people get very tangible information about, how to do something different in their lives, or it helps them to rethink something that they've been struggling with. And I don't think that that always translates to a higher profile guest.
And specifically for Black women, why is it so important to be receiving, these resources and stories and, access to, mental health information?
Yeah, I don't think it's any secret that we were not at the foundations of the field, right? And so, so many of the theories and, like the pioneers in the field did not necessarily have people like us in mind when they were developing these theories and these treatment plans and all of these things. And so I think it is really important to have the lens that we bring as Black women and to have conversations about what mental health looks like specifically for us. Now, understanding, of course, that Black women are not a monolith either, but I think when we share a variety of our experiences, it gets a little closer to something that everybody individually could kind of latch on to.
Being a therapist is about helping people, not crunching numbers. But when you're running your own practice, managing finances can feel like a full-time job, one you never trained for. That's where Herd comes in. Herd is the financial management platform built just for therapists. No more cobbling together spreadsheets, DIY software, or expensive accountants. With Herd, you get bookkeeping, tax support, and financial insights, all in one easy-to-use platform. Herd was started by an accountant and a software engineer who understand the challenges you face as a business owner. Our mission? To make it incredibly easy for therapists to manage their practice as a business, build wealth, and stay focused on what matters most, their clients. Join thousands of therapists who trust Herd with their finances. Schedule a free consultation today at joinherd.com/consult.
And so we've talked about the podcast, we talked about directory, we talked about speaking. You also wrote a book, as if you didn't have enough.
As if there was not enough going on.
Right. How did that come to be?
That actually came to be because of the podcast as well.
Okay.
So again, I
All right, takeaway, just start a
I
podcast.
feel like
Everything
this is
else is
becoming
just,
a
yeah.
promo for starting a podcast, but
Right.
definitely don't start a podcast if you don't have the energy and time to do that, right? So Dr. Melvin Barkey's had a program, I think it still exists, the Healthcasters, where he taught mental health professionals how to actually podcast. So I had ideas, but I had no idea, like, how do you have something that starts as an idea in your head and like upload it to Apple, right? Like, so he laid out all of the, like, here's how you do all the technical stuff. Here's how you choose a name. Here's how you plan for stuff. So that was an important part of my process as well. So if you are interested, then definitely look at Dr. Voorhees' work in the Healthcasters to maybe help you think about that. But the book came from my agent listening to the podcast. And so she listened to a couple of episodes, and I actually had conversations with several different agents, all from the podcast, like people who, because that's the agent's job, right? Like they're always on the lookout for like people who have some new interesting perspective, people who have like growing platforms. Like that is their job, to be on the lookout for these people. So when I had the conversation with the person who became my agent, she had listened to several episodes of the podcast and said, I think you have a book that should come out of this. And at the time, I did end up signing with her, but we had a conversation probably a year before I ever signed with her as my agent, because I didn't know what book I wanted to write. Like I figured at some point in my career I would write a book, but nothing felt very burning and pressing to me. And so I think when I did end up signing with her, we had a conversation about, she said, you will likely, there may be several books that you write in your life, but if you had to like plant your flag in the ground and say, this is the first book that comes from Dr. Joy, what would it be about? And when she phrased it that way, then it felt like sisterhood was a very natural answer, just because it felt like it was, again, at the central and the core of so much of the work that I have been doing at Therapy for Black Girls. And Sisterhood Heals actually was supposed to be our very first in-person event. And so that was in 2020. And then, of course, we know what 2020 came to be. And so we had to cancel it because of the pandemic. But in conversations with my agent, she said, what were you planning to do that weekend? Like, what kinds of topics were you planning to cover? And that kind of became the loose outline for what Sisterhood Heals, the book, became.
Well, interesting. So the book title actually came from an event.
That
It didn't happen.
never happened. Right. Eventually,
Wow.
hopefully, Sisterhood Heals, the event will happen, but it was from the event we had to cancel because of the pandemic.
And then tactically, what was the process like for you? It sounds like you had an agent. Did you have to write a proposal, and did that get pitched to publishers? What was that process like? Can you walk me through that?
Yeah, so my agent was very, very hands-on in helping me to craft the proposal for the book, and I actually worked with another writer because I had never written a book proposal before. So, you got to work with the experts who do the things that you're trying to do. And so she helped me to craft the proposal, which I think ended up being 15 to 20 pages. And your book proposal is kind of like, here's an outline of what I think I want to write in this book. And they usually ask for like a sample chapter or at least a portion of a chapter that's substantial enough for them to get a feel of, your writing style. Your book proposal also includes like a little bit of a marketing plan. So how do you plan to get people to buy this book, where you talk about like, what is your online reach? What famous friends do you have? What radio connections do you have? Right? Like, how are you planning to actually get this book out to the people? And what are the comparable titles that would be equivalent to your book, right? Because the book needs to make sense in the marketplace, right? So, every now and then I'm sure there's some kind of unicorn book, but people who have read and purchased other books, what book is your book in conversation with? And so your book proposal also includes a list of like, here are some comparable titles that I think people who read this would also be interested in my book. And so after you complete the proposal, my agent sent it out to editors at certain houses. So Penguin Random House, well, that's who I signed with. I'm forgetting Harper Collins, like all the major publishing houses. She sent it out to editors at those specific places who she thought would be a good fit. And then they do what is it called an auction. Well, actually, we didn't go to auction because my editor kind of took it off the table before we went to auction. But they send it out and they kind of offer the highest bid, so to speak. And then you decide who you're going to go with.
We talked about therapy and kind of therapists being predominantly white in a white industry, book publishing. And so just great to have the opportunity to be able to have that book published. What was the actual book writing process like for you? Was that a grind?
Very much a grind. Very much a grind. I also worked with another writer, Tracy Lewis Giggets, who helped me to write Sisterhood Heals. Because again, I had never written a book. And so, I would have these ideas of what I wanted the chapters to be, but she would also give me writing prompts and like interview me and say, okay, go write about this. And then like help me to craft that into a story. Because what I found is that, as therapists, we're trained to be very clinical in our language, right? And like give bare minimum because we only want to give like case notes, like only what we would want discovered by an attorney, right? And so I found that I was like writing in that way, and they were like, this is not making a good story. Like, this is great for your case notes. This is not how you tell a story. And so she would also help me to like make the language more flowery and like, okay, how do we actually get from point A to B and make this like a good story? That was, I think, life-saving to me, because otherwise I feel like I might still be toiling over trying to get the book done. But working with somebody who has written several books and worked with authors, because I very much wanted it to still be my book and, be in my words. Working with her, I think, was a saving grace to get that project done.
So she was an editor or ended up being like a co-author?
So technically, I think she's a ghostwriter, and ghostwriting, I think, can come in lots of different forms. So sometimes they just like write it completely, right? Like they interview you and then kind of take your words and write it. But we kind of like collaboratively worked on it, where she would, again, kind of give me prompts and I would write, and then we would craft it into something that became a chapter.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's also this misconception that writing a book is something that makes you a lot of money. So I just want to talk about that as well, right? And just the sort of the financial model of writing a book where you get an advance, right? So could you talk about that and obviously you don't have to share specifics, but kind of what that is like and how do you actually kind of make money from writing a book?
Yeah. So you do, when you work with a major publishing house, you typically get an advance, which is them saying like, okay, here's this money, basically to kind of clear your schedule so that you can actually focus on writing this book. And so they give you an advance, but it is not all given to you at the same time, which I did not learn again until I was in the process. So it's typically split into fourth. So you get a fourth when you sign. You get the next portion when you turn in your first completed manuscript. You get the third portion on the day of, like, not the day of, but like generally around the time when the book is actually published. And you don't get that fourth portion until a year after the book has been out. Yeah. So it's split into a very long, time interval there. And so again, thinking about finances, and then the way that you make money when you hear people talk about royalties is if the publishing house makes their money back from that advance. Anything after that is then what you would get in the form of royalties.
And those royalties generally aren't that much,
They're
right?
not
Like I
huge.
remember seeing checks the Gottmans would get, who sold millions of books, right?
Uh-huh.
And it's like a few $100s.
Right.
I remember being so surprised by that. And so I guess the takeaway: don't write a book if you want to make a lot of money. But
Yeah.
just like having a podcast, I think writing a book also opens up other opportunities. Do you feel like that's opened up doors for you now, being an author?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, a lot of times people will also use them as like a very fancy card, right? Because like a very fancy business card, because it does open up speaking engagements, right? So now typically when I would just maybe have a speaking fee, in addition to my speaking fee, I typically require like so many of my books to be purchased as a part of my speaking like package. And so it also is a great calling card, I think, for people who want to do more speaking, because you have a thing like people can go read the book and say, oh, we'd love to bring them in to speak on this topic or some element of the book. So again, I think it can also be used as a lead magnet. I would not say that most people are making a ton of money from writing books, especially as therapists. If you're still in private practice, like, you're still running your practice probably. And so you are not necessarily cranking out like another book every year. Now, career authors might be making enough money, but if you're kind of, somebody who has one or two books, then probably you're not making enough money just writing books to really support yourself and your family.
Yeah, I've heard that if your goal is to be a professional author, the first book is to sell the second book, and then the second book is to sell the third, right? And then each time, assuming that you have success, that advance,
Gets
goes
bigger.
up.
Yep.
The other piece of this is that the work isn't done when the book is done, right? Because now you actually have to market and promote the book. So what was that like?
Oh my gosh, it was so painful. It was so painful, Michael. I thought writing the book was a difficult part until I got to the marketing stage and was like, oh, this is so much worse, I think, than the writing piece of it, because it's just a constant, like, I think that books are easy to sell, even as somebody with a large platform, right? In my own podcast where people are hearing me talk every week, like that doesn't necessarily translate to people buying the book. And so, it was like an endless tour of podcast episodes. So, doing episodes on my own podcast, but also being a guest on other people's podcasts. I did have a book tour for the book. And so I was in, I think, 6 to 8 different cities, all in the span of maybe a month. It is very much a grind. And so you hear authors tell you to kind of get prepared for that launch week hurricane. But honestly, I think until you're in it, like, you can't, really know what it's going to be like. It just is kind of never ending, right? Because the marketing or the publishing company kind of does a lot in the beginning, like right at your launch window, but kind of beyond that first month, you really are kind of on your own to figure out like how are you going to keep momentum going for your book sales. And so, I think because you're signed to a big publishing company that like, oh, they're the machine behind this, but that machine kind of goes away and moves on to whoever is next in line, right, with their book.
So with all that said, are you thinking about a second book?
No. No, because I think it uprooted so many things, right? Like just the writing of it, was difficult. I mean, in addition to, all of my work, I'm also a wife and a mom. And so, it just kind of took time away from so many things. I also feel like I did not have as much control in the book writing process as I thought. I mean, as somebody who has kind of built all of these things where I can like choose the color and I can choose what I want this to look like the book cover, I had some say in, but was not like my final, like I didn't have final say so in any of it. And so I didn't like or having to kind of give up so much control of the creative of, what this product with my name became. So I just didn't love that. And the marketing piece just was not at all for me. So I really am not thinking that another book is in my near future, at least right now.
It is interesting as somebody who hosts a podcast and is kind of used to this format, going on podcasts, doing interviews. It has to be different because you're out there promoting your book versus, having a conversation. And it sounds like that shift you just didn't really like.
Well, no, it wasn't even necessarily the being a guest. It was just the quantity, right? I mean, because you're trying to sell as many books as possible. So it would not be uncommon for me to have like 8 to 10 podcast interviews in a week, right? Where I'm used to, maybe we record 2 or 3 a week, right? And so it's just a very different shift. And like the quantity of it, I think just became a lot as we were leading up to launch.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm curious, how are you managing your energy and your time now? I know that you and the team, you take some time off over the holidays, which is nice, right? Like you guys just shut down for a month or so. How are you thinking about speaking engagements and appearances and kind of where you're spending your energy?
Yeah, so one of the byproducts of the pandemic is that I got very comfortable at my house. So it takes a lot for me to
Yeah.
even leave the house at this point. And again, my 2 little ones who are not so little anymore, like my oldest will be heading to middle school next year. And so, I really want to be present for those kinds of things. And so I feel like I'm much more calculated around, okay, I'm leaving my house, but at what cost? And so it has to be worth it to me in terms of like, where am I going? I'm also not somebody who really loves to travel. And so those are not like, oh, I have so much fun like being on a plane and like being in a hotel. Like I actually don't love that. And
Interesting.
so, I think it takes a lot of energy and like I need energy then to come back. And so I am much more judicious with my yes to speaking engagements. Like they really have to make sense for me to want to do them. And the podcast and like the Patreon, we just launched our Patreon channel, like that is consuming a lot of my energy. And so it really requires me to kind of be as hands-on as possible and not be in 6 different states at a time. And so I don't do as much speaking anymore, but when I do, they tend to be like bigger conferences or things that I'm really really interested in.
Let's talk about Patreon because you had the Sister Circle community. So can you tell me about the evolution of that?
Yeah, so there has always, as you heard me talk about, like the Facebook group started basically when the podcast started, because one of the things that Melvin talked about as a part of the Healthcasters was that you want a place for people to talk about your podcast, right? Like you get people excited and then they want to have a place to talk about it. So that was something that he talked about, is having a community that you allowed your listeners to go to talk about the podcast. And so that started with the podcast and really has just evolved as the brand has grown and as the podcast has grown. So the Facebook group is still there and that's free, but we also needed to have people in place to be able to moderate conversations, right? Like when you're having mental health kinds of conversations, it's important to have people there who are monitoring and, offering resources and paying attention to things. And so that comes at a cost, which means that at some point we have to have paid offerings as a part of our community. And so we started on Mighty Networks in what we call the Sister Circle, which was originally the Yellow Couch Collective, right? It had several different names, but basically it was, like a paid community, right? Like a Facebook group, but you kind of owned it and it was on a separate platform. And then recently, we did some market research and we found that like people didn't really understand what was going on in Mighty Networks, right? Like it felt very confusing to them and they didn't necessarily know what was happening. And Patreon, I think, is something that is more familiar to people who listen to podcasts because so many podcasters have them, right? And so I think you hear Patreon, oh, this is like additional content we give. These are conversations we can have. And so last month we made the switch to have our community hosted on Patreon now. And so we've been really excited with the kinds of conversations that we're having there, but we've also launched some additional segments from the podcast. So we have an Ask Dr. Joy segment where I answer questions from members of the Patreon community that they have around like career or relationship stuff, kind of general topics. And then we have another segment called So My Therapist Says, where we kind of unpack some of the hot hot takes that people have on social media around mental health. And it's me and another therapist typically. So we've released the first episode of that. And it was all about using AI as a therapist, as your therapist, right? Because we see lots of people talk about like, oh, is AI going to replace therapists? And so I really wanted to bring in another colleague to talk about like, what are some of the pros and cons that you may not be aware of using AI? We are excited about being able to offer additional content that is beyond just what we talk about on the podcast.
I love that. There's a lot of folks who are, who are listening who probably have a Facebook group that's free or some sort of community that they manage. And so I'm curious, based on your experience, like, are there, certain things that have worked in order to kind of get people from a free community to a paid community, or just learnings that you've had?
I think at some point you do have to introduce a paid version because, again, I think if you're talking about any kinds of mental health topics, like you definitely need somebody in there moderating, right? And so it probably can't be you because you're building and running your practice. And so that means somebody has to be involved and those people need to be, taken care of. And so I think at some point, maybe sooner than later, introducing some kind of, even if it is a minimal fee, that does help you to support taking care of the group and making sure it's like a quality space. I think that that's something that's really important. I also think thinking about like what kinds of topics or what kinds of offerings do you want to have as a part of your community? Because you of course have to be careful, right? Like anybody with a license, like you have to be very clear that like what you're doing is not like to be confused with therapy, or that, people don't think that they are in like a therapeutic relationship with you. And so I think making sure that you are thinking about what exactly is it that you're offering as a part of your community, and making sure that people understand what the offer is.
Yeah, I think those disclaimers, that's all super important. I know on your show, I think like at the beginning, right, you say like, this is not therapy.
It's not therapy.
So you cannot sue me.
Right.
You offered an event for therapists for the first time last year. Herd was involved. I was actually supposed to speak, and then I got COVID like the day before I was supposed to come down, which was very disappointing, but it's happening again. Could you tell our listeners about that and kind of just some details about the event?
Yeah, so this is our second therapist summit because, again, the community kept saying they wanted places where they could connect. I think therapists sometimes feel pretty isolated, especially if you're not like in a group practice or if you're in a city where there are not a lot of other Black therapists. We got feedback that people really wanted to be able to come together with colleagues, right? And especially in a post-pandemic or wherever we are in that space, people wanted to kind of be back outside and like connecting with people in person. And so we had our first event last year, and then it is coming back this year, July 24th through the 26th, again in Atlanta. At some point, we may look at different cities, but it's easier because I'm here in Atlanta.
Right. You don't want to leave.
Yeah. Right. And I already said I don't love leaving.
Right.
So,
we got to come to you.
You gotta come to me. But it really is designed to be, kind of how do you think about scaling your practice, and also how are you taking care of yourself, right? So we are planning to have some conversations this year around how to read contracts as a therapist, because as more of us have done more on social media, have different kinds of brand deals and partnerships with different organizations, like you need to know what people are asking you for, and that's not our training, right? And so we want to have a conversation around that. Also a conversation around, like what does it look like to maybe recession proof your practice? Because I know that is a looming concern for people, like what's happening. Are people going to start, scaling back on what they're offering? And I think as therapists, we have so much to offer in terms of a private practice, but also workbooks and speaking engagements and podcasts. Like there are lots of ways that our skills can be transferable to other places. And so thinking about what like a next step in your practice could be, but also just some time for fun and hanging out with other therapists where you don't have to kind of be on, but really can get some good networking in with other colleagues.
Something we've talked about is therapists seem to have just some Zoom fatigue, especially if they're doing sessions online, they're doing their CEs online. And so just like the opportunity to connect in person, that space, I mean, it's so needed. And so definitely go check that out. We'll get this episode out before that, so make sure that
beautiful
folks still have time to sign up. We're coming to the end here, so I have some rapid fire questions to wrap us up. How's that sound?
Okay, sounds good. I love a good rapid fire.
All right. Who is one guest that you want to have on the podcast that you haven't yet?
Beyonce.
Duh. What? Who would be your second choice?
Issa Rae.
Love that.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we're manifesting that.
Yes, we're
They're
manifesting.
both coming on the show. What about a podcast that you would like to be a guest on?
Oh, I've done so many cool podcasts.
Even like maybe a TV show?
I probably would have to say the Oprah podcast, just because I feel like, like she has a lot of like super soul kinds of conversations that like neatly align with my work. So maybe Oprah's podcast.
Love that. I was going to suggest the Jennifer Hudson show. Get your walkout.
Oh, yes. But everybody doesn't get a tunnel. So I might not get a
really?
tunnel and I'd be disappointed.
That's funny. What's one thing that you wish people understood about mental health for Black women?
I wish that more people understood that Black women are not robots and that we deserve the same gentleness and care that is offered to other people.
Finally, what's one thing you want therapists to take away from this conversation?
I want therapists to take away the idea to stay curious and to think about all of the different ways that the skills that we have can be transferred to other places. So practice is a great way to start. And if that's all you want to do, then that's great. But I think a lot of people have interest in doing other things and reaching more people. And I think the sky really is the limit on what that can look like for you.
Love it. Dr. Joy, thank you so much. For folks who want to connect with you, where can they find you and, learn more about the work that you do?
Yeah, so I am at Hello Dr. Joy across all of the social media channels. My website is hellodrjoy.com, and then you can pay attention and keep up with everything at Therapy for Black Girls at therapyforblackgirls.com.
Amazing. We'll drop all of that in the show notes. Thank you so much. Very grateful for you and grateful for our friendship.
Thank you, Michael. It was great to chat with you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Herd Business School, brought to you by Herd, the financial management platform for therapists. To get the class notes for this week's episode, go to joinherd.com/podcast. And don't forget to subscribe on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll see you in the next class.